Tell me, what is Raksha Inc?
Raksha is a local nonprofit, and Raksha means protection in many of the South Asian languages. We work towards healing, empowerment, and justice for South Asian survivors of violence, and our mission is to promote a stronger and healthier South Asian community through confidential support services, education, and advocacy.
How did Raksha Inc get started?
It was started by two young women who grew up in Augusta who remembered an auntie that was going through a domestic violence situation. And later on in life, when one of them was an attorney, her name is Sunita Iyer, she was volunteering for organizations in New York and New Jersey, our sister organizations, and thought, wow, wouldn't it have been fabulous if we had something like this in Georgia? So she took a sabbatical, came back to Georgia, and helped start Raksha, recruited one of her friends that she grew up with, who was here in Emory getting a counseling degree, named Sonia, and they began the footwork to become Raksha. And then I started volunteering a few months within it starting.
Wow. So you've been here from the beginning.
Yes, I have.
What drew you to this work?
You know, gosh, that's a complicated question. You know, in your bones, like from childhood, you know there are certain issues you want to address, right? And I always knew I wanted to deal with domestic violence, child abuse as a child. Maybe it was watching, you know, those made-for-TV specials growing up. But then as I've gotten older, I kind of wonder if there is a generational reason that I deal with it, because I believe that my grandmothers, you know, while my grandfathers were great people, there was probably some abuse going on, and I'm wondering if it's a way to end generational patterns and cycles, a way to kind of fight for something different for the upcoming women in my life. Yeah, I think and it's just something that's meant the world. None of our families are perfect. We've seen domestic violence in our families. We've seen domestic violence in our community. And so it's something that's always, I've known since high school that this is something I wanted to address and work with. Did I think I would do it in my own community? I had no idea I'd be doing it in my own community, but I knew it was work I always wanted to do.
How is it doing this work in your own community?
Oh, complicated and healing in many ways, right? Growing up, I didn't think that I would have the community really be supportive of this, and I always felt like I was the odd one wanting to do all this. And I think in the years of doing this work, seeing the folks who really want to stand up and make a difference and change cultural norms, change the way we support each other, that's been so healing. It's been a way for me to really connect and love my culture even more. Because before, when I was younger, I'd want to run away from it because I didn't always agree with the things that I thought were our beliefs and cultural norms. And when I say that, when we talk about domestic and sexual violence, it is prevalent in every culture, right? So I don't want to just say only our culture has it. It just plays out differently in each culture, right? So we may talk about, let's just say in the South Asian serials, you have these kitchen accidents, right? Yeah. And that is how many women may die as a result of domestic violence, and that violence may come from in-laws or, you know, their partner. But here in the United States, a lot of women die because of gun violence. Right? So knowing that the violence may play out differently, but culturally it goes across the board in all of our cultures. But I know that there's this belief that there are ways that it plays out in our culture, whether it's the belief systems, the sayings, or the roles. And so just being aware. So the more I learn, the more I connect to the community, the more that I've done work in the community, I've seen both, the good and the bad, right? And so I think that's where I've had opportunities to heal and just learn to love my culture and learn to recognize the resilience and the power that we have within.
Not to say that you don't love your culture, you just realize maybe that there are some things that can be hurtful, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think when I was younger, all I saw what was negative in my culture, right? I didn't see the resilience, I didn't see the strength, I didn't see the women that stand up or how community can stand up, right? In doing this work, you see the family members that stand up. You see the ones that are cowards and don't do anything, but I learned to see all elements and learn to appreciate, number one, that this is true across all cultures, right? But also being able to really, having grown up here, to really honor and love my culture a lot more than I did when I was younger. And that goes in like growing up in Georgia. We didn't have as many South Asians here, right? We were one of few. So you didn't like being different, right? And you didn't have time to be immersed in the culture because we were such a small portion. It's changed now. Yeah. But when I was younger, I just had a different view, and I was just trying not to really own my culture so much because it was different and it was hard, right? And I wasn't immersed in it. And, having gone back to visit my family, having been immersed in the culture here, my views have changed. And I've grown to love and accept my culture for what it is, right? The good and the bad.
Tell me more about your culture and your upbringing, and how was growing up, maybe American, different than what you probably would have expected had you grown up completely embedded in your culture?
Well, I mean, at the time, if you, the funny thing is, if you look at my birth certificate, I was born here in Atlanta, Georgia, it lists me as Caucasian.
Okay.
Right? I mean,
obviously melanated, but okay.
As a baby, I guess at the time, it was in the 70s, so I'm giving my age away. Yeah. So I was listed as Caucasian right down the road, right? Northside Hospital. But even though I'm listed as Caucasian, right, that's not what I was growing up, right? My parents had the first Indian restaurant in Atlanta. Having Indian food was a new thing, right? And so Mom would wear sari places. That's not something people saw quite a bit in the 70s. There were probably like maybe 2 of us Indians in my elementary school class, right? There were probably more throughout. I think, maybe they had 4 of us that were Asian total in my
very
class.
Small.
Very
you
small.
You can count on one hand.
Right, exactly. You can count on one hand how many Asians, even like in high school when I graduated, you could count probably on 2 hands how many of us out of a class of 120, right? So I think you felt different. Your culture was different. People weren't as excited about the food. I remember times where, there were some jokes about curry or tandoori chicken, like, because we might have done an outing to the restaurant and people would make fun of the food. Yeah. So you did feel different, right? Your name was not like everybody else's. Your culture was not the same. Your parents, and then you're struggling because, my parents especially my mom wanted me to know the language I speak, right? To be connected to my culture. But my parents worked all the time. So they didn't have the time to explain much about our faith, right? Yeah. Everything was like, you just have to go. Well, I don't understand the reasoning behind it, right? It's not what my friends are doing, and I would go with my friends to do other things. So I just couldn't appreciate when I was younger, like the differences, if that makes sense. Even though I had friends that loved it and would participate in some of our faith-based, like our, what we call pujas and stuff like that we had at our home. But it just was like, you just didn't want to be different. And what kid wants to be different, right? Yeah. It wasn't celebrated then. And then you're always like, well, I'm so different. So, but I grew into who I am. And luckily I did have friends who loved my culture. And now I can see friends who are like, oh, let's go get Indian food. I love it. And I'm just like, wait. That's not what I grew up with, yes. Right? So there's a much more appreciation for the culture and where we come from. And luckily, I went to a school right off Beaufort Highway. Went to Cross Keys High School, so there was definitely diversity there. And I was really lucky to be connected to people from different cultures, which, integrated, it just made me feel connected to wanting to learn more about other cultures, to do this work with other cultures, and all that made more sense. And honestly, I started working for City of Atlanta as an intern and then working with them, and I would see folks who spoke different languages, right? Not getting interpreters. So all that kind of really meant so much more for me to be able to show up because I understood the challenges around language access, why it's important to have an interpreter, why it's important for someone to know what's happening in a court hearing, and to know, instead of just sitting there and no one explaining, and then having the courts reset so many times because there wasn't an interpreter there and people didn't do the work that they needed to do to make sure that the victim knew what was happening. So I spent many times speaking broken Spanish, trying to at least let someone know what was going on. Otherwise, they sit there with a blank face, not knowing what's happening.
Yeah. Were there times, especially as you began working with people of different cultures, that you noticed things culturally? Was that like the first time you really started to notice, like, oh, this thing in my culture is not that great. Look how this plays out somewhere else. Did that ever play a part in how you came to your work?
I mean, I would have avoided my community and culture, really? Altogether. I would have avoided it, honestly, because I had my own views of the belief system, that it wasn't supportive, right? And it wasn't until when Raksha was starting, it's actually my father who handed me the flyer when Raksha was starting. He saw it at an Indian grocery store and handed me the flyer, that I thought, oh my gosh, let me see if I can make a difference in my own community. And so that's how I got involved with working with the South Asian community. Because when I first started working, I was working instead of Atlanta. I was we were working in what was then Thomasville Heights, Inglewood Manor, and Capitol Homes. So we were doing the Weed to Seed project. So we would go in and provide support for communities that were impacted by crime, right? That led to doing the work for it was close to the 1996 Olympics. I'm totally dating myself here. And I was in charge of helping getting the multicultural aspects, because we were going to have all these international visitors. So I was working with a lot of the immigrant and refugee organizations providing services to the community. And that's where I started to feel really comfortable, like working with other refugee and immigrant communities. I was able to connect to my heritage and dive deeper into that. And I knew that this is the place I wanted to be, because I understood the nuances of being from a different culture. Even though I was born here, like having immigrant parents, growing up with the Bengali community, it was important everything made sense so quickly. So I think that's where I started to say, this makes sense. I see what the challenges are. How can I get involved, and how can I make a difference? And then led to us doing a lot of work around culture, right? And one of my mentors, I used to be scared to talk about culture and do that training because it's complex, right? And then one of my mentors said, okay, you do this presentation, I can't be here. And I started diving into training on culture a lot more. And then you get to kind of look at the nuances of all of our cultures, right? And the complexities. So it's not like our culture is more violent than another. There's a culture of violence that goes across all of our communities.
Can you tell me more about that? Like, what are the culturally specific things that maybe to an outsider you wouldn't notice could be harmful, but especially because you grew up in it and you felt it wasn't supportive, you realize how that can play into familial violence or things like that?
So what are the cultural factors that play out? I mean, I think the thing is that the stuff that's in our different cultures can both be a protective factor, but can also be a harmful factor at the same time. It just depends on how it's played out and how it's used. So for example, having an extended family can be a protective factor because you have more people in the household, less isolation, but it depends on how that family shows up, in which it could be a harmful factor, right? So the extended family can mean you have in-laws that might be abusive. The abuse may come from many factors. So it could be both in many ways. You know what I mean? So even we talk about the role of women, right? The role of women, we have women goddesses in one of our faiths in Hinduism, right? Which is beautiful because we have these images of strong, powerful women, but yet in that we also push women to take on more, to self-sacrifice, to make adjustments. So at the same time, while we revere women, we can also at the same time harm women and expect them to do the impossible, right? Or there's that whole patriarchy that plays into it. The patriarchy can be seen as protective, right? We want to protect the women in our family, but then also it can be enabling and harmful, right? So in anything that we look at, there's this balance of how it can be a protective factor and how it can be harmful.
Yeah, it's so interesting you mentioned that, because I'm thinking, like, I didn't grow up in it, but I've been very much exposed to like the Yoruba culture and how they have women goddesses too. Like the main god had 2 wives. Right. But even in that culture, women especially are encouraged to take on much more space in the domestic sphere than outside of the home. Right. And you mentioned this can across all cultures, and clearly, and that is obviously 2 different countries, 2 different languages, all of that. So what is it, how do you, when you take all of that into account, how do you cater it to the different cultures? Because I'm sure even if there are some similarities, there are some differences that would make it hard to help someone, say, like you have someone who comes from an Indian background versus Bangladeshi or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also the belief system, right? And while some of the stuff may have been true in the United States, maybe 40, 50 years ago, right? This idea, and I can think about this one example of a colleague of mine was dealing with an Indian woman, and this idea of getting a divorce was very hard. This woman was accomplished, and my colleague was working with her, but couldn't understand why she couldn't let go of the idea of divorce, I mean, why she could not get a divorce? Why couldn't she? And it's the stigma. How does your community respond when you get a divorce, right? And so one thing that might be common is there might be alienation. Friends may not show up. You don't get invited to the same parties because of the stigma of getting a divorce. Now, it's changing. And the one thing about culture is it's constantly changing, right? Back home, it might be changing where people are getting a divorce. It really depends on whether you're in the big city or if you're in a rural area or a village. But that's the same here. Yeah. Like in Metro Atlanta, you can, getting a divorce may not be a big deal, but if you're in a small town, that might have a totally different impact of how people treat you, what people say, how they gossip about you. And it's the same thing in some of our communities. So here, you have the South Asian woman talking to an American colleague who's had a divorce, maybe had a couple of them. She doesn't understand why it's so hard, not knowing all the messages we get growing up, right? Like I can think about myself from childhood. Don't go out in the sun, you'll get too dark, no one's gonna marry you. Don't burn your hand, right? Then you won't find a good husband. So from childhood, you're hearing this whole thing about finding a good husband and getting married being the ultimate end goal, right? And then what happens when that marriage doesn't work out? And as a South Asian community, whether we have the money or not, a lot of money is spent on these weddings, right? There's a whole emphasis on these weddings and marriages. And so thinking about socially what we do and the emphasis we put on marriage, when that marriage doesn't work out, when it ends, it impacts our psyche, right? Even as we talk about sexual assault, some of the things that are impacted by the students when we've done work with some of the college students, the things that we hear is that the messages that they get from their parents make it difficult for them to even talk to their parents about sexual assault. Like the assumption is, what were you wearing? Why were you out? That they'll get all those questions. And so a lot of times one of the things that we hear is that the students don't feel comfortable going to their parents. I recall one doctor when we were doing one educational outreach event said, yeah, I worked at a university and I would see these young South Asian students sitting all by themselves, whereas other survivors who were impacted by sexual assault had a community around them. So the shame that we put on it, the value we put on, talking about sexual assault or talking about, the purity when you get married, right? How that impacts people coming forward and talking about sexual violence, it's really difficult, right? So those are the barriers that people may not think about and may not think about how many layers you have to go through. But if you know someone from the culture, you don't have to explain that. Yeah. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to be protective of your culture. We know that's the reality of what you may be dealing with.
It's so interesting you talk about the messages and the shame because growing up American, it's not that much different from what we hear. What is it? Are the cultural differences so different that maybe someone couldn't understand? Because I'm sitting here and listening and I think but also Black American, Caribbean heritage, somewhat similar. I seem like if I were to sit in this position and talk to a woman, it wouldn't be that different.
But you also immerse yourself in different cultures. You're connected to many cultures. That's who you are, right? That's how I've seen you in the community.
True. That's very true.
Not everybody's in that. They have their own reality and things might be black and white. And just because they have been told something else, they don't realize that other people may get a different message, right? I grew up with a dad who was a wonderful and empowering and all that stuff, but I still know what my culture says, right? I still know the messages we get, And so I think it's important to know, yes, we do understand it, but do we really tap into reflecting and looking that way and looking at whether other cultures, feel a certain way or do things the same way we do? Do we do that introspective of like, oh, I can see where this plays out in my own culture, right? People don't always do that. They don't look at how their culture has dual messages. The one thing I always hear about, oh, well, domestic violence is a crime here in the United States. It's part of their culture. That's what I hear when I do trainings. And what I always have to say is, well, we have a Violence Against Women Act. There are millions, billions of dollars that go into that. It is part of the American culture just as much as is a part of every other culture.
Which is why the law is there.
Exactly. But they're like, well, it's not, but it is a problem. How many women are dying as a result of domestic violence? How many bystanders or officers are shot in the line of domestic violence? I mean, an officer is more likely to be killed on a domestic violence call than any other call. So it is very much an issue that is dealt here. It's just that we have cultural nuances. How do we connect with community? And I think even within the African American community, when you do outreach from the African, they may not trust law enforcement, right? So you have to figure out how to navigate, how do you build trust, and how do you talk about what you see culturally on a day-to-day basis, depending on where you grow up. What do you see? What's it like in your neighborhood, right? And those are all the things we have to think about when we're doing culturally specific work in our communities.
So if I'm a woman, I pick up the phone, I call that toll-free line on your website. Walk me through what would happen, if I say to you, I don't feel safe in my home and I need help.
So the first thing we'll do is we're going to assess your safety. Like, are you safe right now? Is it something that we can call you back, or do we have to do some quick planning, right? We're not going to go out and pick you up. I think people think we're going to go in and rescue people. We're going to think about the safest way to connect you to the resources that are most important to you, right? So if you need to get out of the house, we have to figure out how to get you out of the house. If you need a referral, need to get connected to an attorney, we might connect you to an attorney to help you look at, family law related issues. It might be something where someone might have questions about their immigration, because abuser might be threatening to not file the immigration paperwork or let them become undocumented or have them deported. So sometimes it's just kind of, number one, getting the information that you're being told and getting the truth, right? Because some survivors will hear like, oh, just because you're an immigrant or you don't speak English well, you're not going to get custody of the kids. No one's going to believe you based on the fact that you don't speak English or that you have an accent or that you are on a green card or that you're on a temporary visa. So there's all these fears that part of what we're doing is demystifying, kind of like getting the myths kind of addressed, but that's what abusers tell them. And sometimes you have community members also giving advice. So it's a lot of information that an individual has to filter through. So depending on what they need, we might help them. You saw we have a culturally specific food pantry, so we might help get them resources. Help get them food, connect them to attorneys. We might provide them with counseling that we may provide in-house, or we may outsource it depending on the need. We may help them apply for benefits if they're eligible. We may help connect them to other resources. In some situations, we have a small transitional housing program where we're paying rent for up to 2 years, or we might do short-term rental assistance. So we try to be holistic in providing support. We could be referring them to medical related needs. So it just depends on what they need. Yeah. And part of us is just giving them information so they can make a choice that's best for themselves. Not everybody leaves. Yeah. Some people stay in situations, and we're not telling people what to do. They've got to make an assessment that's best for them. We may work with children and helping provide them with counseling, because witnessing abuse has a lifelong impact on children. And so being able to provide support so that they can heal and so that they can break generational cycles is an important part of our work as well.
It's so interesting you mentioned how someone could use someone's immigration status as a tool and as a weapon. It's like such an extra layer that I think most people who are in an abusive relationship don't even have to think about. It's, can I get out and get out safely with my children? Not, can I get out safely and stay in this country that I came to?
Right, and it's way more complicated when you look at the different levels of immigration. Imagine someone on a student visa. Yeah. If they're on a student visa, their being legal or having status is all based on them being enrolled in school, right? Then we have folks that are on worker visas and their wives are dependent and they may not have access to work even though they're legally here. So how do you leave an abusive situation when you don't have permission to work? Now, there is a relief that we worked on that's part of the Violence Against Women Act, that people can get a temporary status while they're figuring things out. But like, that's where culturally specific, most people wouldn't know about that. But if you're South Asian, that was something that uniquely impacted our community. And we had to advocate for that temporary relief while folks figure things out, because otherwise, if you can't work, you can't stay in a shelter forever, right? How do you leave an abusive situation, right? If your employer, if you're working for someone, what if someone's on a work visa and their employer is sexually assaulting them, right? If you report them, that could also impact your immigration status. So there's so many ways and so many layers of how this work plays out that folks who don't know our community, who don't understand immigration, are not going to know what relief is available to them. So it is complicated, and it's not as black and white as people make it out to be, because it's very complicated. It's not that everybody crosses the border. People may come in and their status is impacted by someone else who has the power to impact it, right?
How have things like maybe technology and social media impacted your work? Because I know now we see the TikToks, right? Like if you're in an unsafe situation, there's secret hand signals and all these things. Has that helped or hindered your work at all?
It can be both, right? I mean, with technology, there's more ways to track people. So you can check their phones, you can stick one of those air tags on them. So, so technology has gotten better in some ways, that people can document things a lot easier. Maybe they could record something, maybe there's a video, maybe they can ask for help. But I mean, also it's another way for someone else to surveil another person. So there's the positive and negatives in everything, in that it can be really great because we may have more ways to document, but there's also more ways to surveil. So that way people may have things in their room where the abuser is listening to them, or they're able to see who they're emailing because they've got something on their computer that can track what they're doing.
That's scary.
Right. So sometimes people have to go to libraries or use somebody else's computer, because technology, like I said, it's scary, like what people have been doing. Just like we have like the, like the AI generated imaging, right? That people can set people up, or the way that people can do videos and share it without being traced. You know what I mean? So people may take explicit videos, and that might be another way that they're intimidating someone, like, we're going to share it to your entire family, right? And sharing videos that are private in public spaces, and then it not being able to be tracked because people can hide. So then you can't even hold someone accountable.
That is absolutely petrifying to think about.
Yeah.
Just the thought. I can't imagine being in that scenario.
Yeah, and it's scary, and like we don't know how to, we don't have all the pathways to address this and trace it, and that makes it hard.
I read on the website that it's not just women, there are men you help as well. How is that culturally different, especially because we touched on this earlier? There's a patriarchy there, and there's this understanding that men are supposed to be in a certain authoritative position, a position of power, of protection within the family.
Well, I mean, with anything, there's an exception, right? We have gentle souls who end up in marriages, and they might be in a situation where they're being abused. And again, who's got the power? Again, when we talk about domestic and sexual violence, it's always about power and control. And so depending on who has the power, what's going on, abuse can happen. Any one of us can be abused, and any one of us can also use violence, right? So I think just to know where the power and control is and what's the situation. You might have a husband who comes who's dependent on their wife, right? And so there might be abuse there, depending on what the power dynamic is. You might have different expectations. So it really just depends. And like I said, nothing is like a set way in anything. Abuse plays out in many different ways. So we acknowledge that there are men who have been impacted by violence, who have been abused in their relationships, might be abused by their parent. Like there's so many ways in which this can play out. They might have been forced to marry someone they didn't want to marry. So that's a weird culture, like the arranged marriage, right? That's a cultural thing that comes in, where you're marrying or you're coerced into a marriage because that's what your family wants. Now, does it happen to everybody? No, but it is a dynamic that plays out in our community.
For people who see this, who, don't fully get or understand why there is such a need for culturally specific services for people, what do you want them to know?
It's just about survivors feeling affirmed and knowing the resources that are based on their reality. It's important, but it's also, think about comfort food, right? When you're in distress and you want your comfort food, it may come from your culture and your ideas, right? And I just think it's about being seen fully for who you are and where you come from, right? And when we're seen fully, then we have more dignity and we have more strength to really hold our power to make the difficult choices we need to make.
Is there a favorite, obviously without giving too many details, is there a success story, a favorite success story you have of someone you've helped and you were to see them come in these doors asking for help and now to see them how they live their life now that you can share with us?
I mean, that might be the person that you're talking to.
Oh, really?
I mean, not that we're supposed to have favorites. I think everybody's journey is their own. But I think, it's important when you think about survivors and their journey and their ability to overcome. And it's never easy. They're overcoming so many different things. And I don't do the direct services work as much as my coworkers do right now. But I just, so many of the survivors have different challenges that come their way. They have different obstacles. But, I think I'm always proud to see how children have grown to become resilient. And I can think about when I've seen children and you can see the fear in their face. And now you can see them exhibiting joy. The survivors that we recently had an event, and the survivors were just happy to be in a space together where they could be themselves with other survivors because they didn't have to put on a front and act like everything's okay. And so I think all the survivors are important and critical in their journey. And so I can't say that there's a favorite, but I'm so grateful to have been with this organization to see them overcome the obstacles that they've faced and also see their children grow up and live violence-free lives or find joy and overcome just the fear that I saw on their face when they were children.
Did you think when you first started working with this organization, that you would still be here more than 20 years later?
Yeah, it's close to 30. This is our 30th year.
This is your 30th year, okay.
So I've been with the organization 27 years as the executive director, but we've been with the organization all 30 years. And no, I didn't think I'd be here this long. I'm still shocked that I've been here this long. But I love this work. And I have friends who are like, oh, why don't you just leave? And I'm like, number one, this is my community. I love my community, right? Atlanta's my community, Georgia's my community, but the South Asian community here in Georgia has been a long part of my history. And so I can't imagine leaving. And I love doing this work. It's hard. It's not easy. You know what I mean? And we were facing new challenges right now, but it's just something I want to fight for and something that's important to me. And I know I didn't talk about the challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, tell me about that. What are some of the challenges that you're facing now?
So we had 2 grants from the Office of Victims of Crime that were terminated on April 22nd. And some of the language was about the priority is serving Americans who've been impacted by sexual assault and human trafficking. And I'm like, well, we're Americans too. Right. So I don't understand why you're terminating these 2 grants that we have. One was a basic needs grant, one was an outreach grant on victim services. And so I think that's the whole thing is I hope that we're seen as an integral part of this community, but when you get a message and your grant is terminated, that we can't continue to serve these communities, then it sends a message of like, okay, I mean, it's equivalent to $700,000 over a 3-year period, right, to do critical work. To have that terminated sends a message that our communities are not as valuable and as important as other communities, and we are a part of this American fabric.
How scary is that to think that you're not going to have that funding and you're not going to be able to do all the work you just told me about?
It's scary. My concerns are if it impacts other funding sources as well, because we get a good amount of federal money to do this work, to help support us in doing this critical work in our community. And if this continues to happen with our other grants, then of course it scares me and makes me worry about whether our organization will still be around to continue to do this important work.
How much would you say you get in federal funding?
I would easily say it's about 80 to 85% of our budget. Wow. Yeah.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
And how many people would you say you serve?
We serve about 500 a year. That's just in direct services. That doesn't include the training and the outreach that we do with the larger community. So part of our work is like creating like I Speak booklets, which we have a sample there, which help like identify languages, but also has information on strangulation. It has information on resources, how to work with the deaf and hard of hearing community, and how to work with interpreters. So it would impact the people we train, which can be 500 to a couple thousand people a year. But then there's the outreach we do with the larger South Asian community, which is, over 100,000 people in the South Asian community. So whether it's the ads in our South Asian publications, where we're talking about resources or opportunities, to the outreach we do around education, like with the college students, and providing resilience and other supportive services. That, that's another, at least 5,000 that we're reaching, if not more, depending on what we're doing.
That's a lot. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
What do you want people to know about your persistence in, despite the challenges, continuing to be here and do this work?
It comes out of a love for my community, a love and faith that I have in the people around me. A lot of people will always ask me, like, why do you continue to stay in the South? Because it's not always easy, but it is my community. I love it. And again, just like our survivors, this organization is resilient, and we will find the tools, and I hope that community will continue to hold us as we continue to overcome some of these challenges.